From the very beginning of designing the GPS project, we had the intention to have an external evaluation as part of the project, carried out by a professional evaluator. And so now I'd like to introduce Natalie Kishchuk, who is the principal at Program Evaluation and Beyond here in Montreal, and a well-known professional evaluator. And she's going to present to us the design and the findings of the evaluation that she has carried out on the GPS project.
Thanks, Michael. You can hold your applause because I'm Madame Paperwork. I'm going to say my little bit about paperwork as I go through. I've put my name on here, but I also want to thank the Project Evaluation Committee. We're co-authors on this, but they can feel free to stand up and say, I don't agree with that as well. I'm going to go into, first of all, just a little bit of the context for the evaluation and the approach that we adopted. Talk about something called a theory of change, just briefly. Present some of the highlights of the results, and so this will be an overview. We've heard from each of the communities that was involved, and we've pulled all this together now to give an overview, and then come to some conclusions about what this told us. So in terms of the context, there's kind of two motivations for doing an external evaluation. First of all, the project really wanted to learn from what it was doing. It was clearly a pilot or a demonstration that had maybe potential for carrying on afterwards, and they wanted to learn and make it the best that they could in this first round of implementation. But also, it's a requirement of the funder. And that, in fact, shaped some of the things that we did in the evaluation. This is federal funding. The federal government has a policy now called the Policy on Results that requires all direct spending to be evaluated more or less every 5 years. In particular, programs that are funded through grants and contributions like this one is. So the department that funded this program also has to evaluate the whole program for the whole of Canada. And we wanted to be able, in this evaluation for this project, be able to help them evaluate broadly and to be able to contribute to that overall picture. So that led us to some of the choices we did in the evaluation. But in the first instance, it was very important that the evaluation answer the questions that the project was asking about itself. So we had what we call a stakeholder-driven approach. The stakeholders being the people who are running the program, the people who care about it, the people who want it to be as good as it can be, drawing them into deciding together how the evaluation would be conducted. So I was just an accompaniment, I was the external resource, and we had a committee that was made up of the local project leaders plus Kelly, who we decided together how the evaluation would be carried out, what would be measured. Together we developed the theory of change that I'm going to present briefly in a sec. The questions and the tools, as well as there was a phase of data collection in which the evaluation committee was more involved than they, I think, had hoped to be. We met regularly throughout the course of the project to review the results. So we kind of followed along how the implementation was going. We met several times to just have an update on what the numbers were saying and what the results were. And we're now at the stage of interpretation and conclusions. And as Michael said, there will be an evaluation report that's an expected outcome of the entire project. So now we move to the theory of change, and really this is an eye test. It's impossible to see. But the idea behind a theory of change is that we start with what we're going to do in terms of activities and look at what that's expected to contribute to in terms of changes at the very, very long term. And then from there we can decide where we're going to focus our evaluation interest, because we're not going to be evaluating in the very long term what happens to the seniors who are touched by the program. We're going to be looking at to what extent something happens sort of in the shorter term. So this is a useful tool for us as evaluators and for an evaluation committee to decide where we're going to focus. But also, this is a part of every federally funded program. The overall program has a diagram like this that's often called a logic model, or there's other variations. But it's helpful, and I'm putting this out there for you that have funding from various kinds of organizations. If you can have a way to develop this kind of tool, it's very helpful because it speaks to funders about how you're tying in with what their bigger vision is. This discussion around this theory of change or logic model led us to recognize that the really important part of how this program was going to work was the connections that the volunteers were making with the seniors, and in particular the trust that they were building. So we've heard a lot about that already, And we focused on that in the evaluation. So that's in this middle part of the model here, this change mechanism and the part in the middle. So that led us to our evaluation question, is about how are those relationships being built. Then, to actually measure that question, or to answer that question, we had a couple of sources of information. The dreaded forms. Now, I have to say that I know it was, I'm going to say a little bit more later on about in particular why in this specific project this is an issue. But having the forms filled out and having all the paperwork is essential to be able to tell the story to the funders about what happened with the money. And so I know that the executive directors understood this, and I know that they took on way more work than they had intended to in helping find a workable solution to have this information be collected. It's so precious, and I just want to say thank you to everybody who worked on filling out those forms, even though it was a real pain. And we tried to make it as light as possible, but of course it was in some ways very much of a burden, but really, really important. And we did, as a result of having worked on the theory of change, measure level of trust, which is the key mechanism for how the project is supposed to be working. And then I also had the opportunity to do phone interviews with about half of the volunteers, and some of them are here today, so thank you again for speaking with me on the phone, to get a feel for what their experience had been like as volunteers. It was identified earlier that there might be concerns about the burden that this relationship places on volunteers, and we wanted to hear from them directly about how they were experiencing that, how they were living the experience for themselves, is to learn some lessons about that as well. So then moving into results, I think. So here's some highlights. So here's the overall numbers. We had, there were altogether 23 volunteers from the 4 organizations. That's a bit shy of the target. The target that was set out in the project funding application was 30 to 36. Now, targets are not meant to be actual things. They're just an idea, a realistic hope, your idea of how things might work out in a pilot project like this. I don't think anybody should measure the success of the project by how close you got to the target, but it shows in what ways the challenges that were actually faced in implementation can affect what happens on the ground. So we got 23 volunteers, and very dedicated volunteers that carried on a lot of work over the time the project was in place. They made a total of 801 contacts, which is a lot of contacts. So this includes all of the individual contacts, that could be the phone calls, the individual visits, as well as in the case of ACDPN, the food bank visits, but not the group activities. So they're not counted in this because it was a different kind of activity. So just to keep that in mind. And they made contact with 88 different isolated seniors across these 4 regions. Now the target was 215, and again, I think there can be some thinking about realistically to take this forward. Over time, how many can you expect to reach? Again, whether it was a target or not, I don't think means anything about the success of the program. They reached 88 seniors, which is really, really fabulous. You can see that over time, so the first bar here is the first quarter of the project, each of these are quarters, that it really got going in the fall of 2017 and has carried on. And even when winter came in, and you saw some of the photos of winter, look at the number of visits that were going on. So that didn't stop the actual level of activity. So that's also very telling. Once the project gets up and running, it stays up and running. In terms of the volunteers' experience, it was really interesting to note that almost all of the volunteers, at least that I spoke with, had been volunteering previously in some capacity in their communities, whether formally or informally. Sometimes it was helping out at their grandchildren's church, sometimes they were doing Meals on Wheels, or they'd been involved in various other kinds of activities. But they were already bringing a wealth of experience and knowledge to the project when they came in. So that was important to note. They got matched with seniors in a process that was sometimes very natural, and sometimes it was a kind of a matching process that happened. And that also went very well. There weren't really any cases where a matchup didn't work out, that people didn't hit it off. In some cases, people were visiting people that they knew already. Now, it was mentioned that in small communities, if you don't know people, you know of them, or you used to know them, or someone in your family knows them, there's some kind of connection already there. So it's not unusual that people would know each other. In some cases, there was already a kind of visiting going on between a volunteer who then got paired with a senior. Now this is an important observation from a funder's point of view, because the funder's going to want to know, so what difference did this money make if that was already going on? So it was important to address that question, and I think we addressed it. I'll speak to that in the conclusions. It did make a difference. It built on the relationships that were there and made them more systematic and more supportive. The visits themselves, as we've heard from the senior volunteers that have spoken today, went really very well. And numerous people, just I think about everybody that I spoke to, said how much they got out of the visits as well, that it was important for them as much as it was for the senior they were visiting. There's a whole range of different activities that they settled on together. It could have been reading, it could have been playing Scrabble, going out to lunch, sometimes they went to appointments, sometimes they went for walks. Depending on what their interests were in common. There was some indication, but it's very hard to tell, and we saw the data on the gender differences just in the senior community, and it's also true in the volunteering community, it's dominated by women. Some suggestion that there was more comfort if the volunteers were matched with seniors of the same gender. I think we're paying more attention to gender-based analysis now, and I think that's something to keep in mind for future planning, that not necessarily always, but it seems to be coming up a little bit. And I said that already, of the benefit. I asked all the seniors that I interviewed if they had found it hard to maintain the boundaries on the relationship. There was content in the training on this, how to be able to manage and not be overburdened and burn out the volunteer, putting the mask on yourself first. And none of them said that this had been a case for them. They had sometimes found that they were being asked to do a lot or to call more often than they had intended to, but they were importantly able to manage that. They knew from their own experience and from the training that they could put the boundaries on it and it would be okay. They found a way to negotiate that with their senior. Also, it was of interest about how the seniors who had family that were around would feel about how the senior's family would feel about the volunteers coming in. In the same way there's a trust relationship for the senior, there might be some with the family members, like who is this person, why are they hanging around my dad, what are the issues that might be around there. And that turned out not to be an issue at all. The family members were very supportive that this extra help was coming in. They had a relationship themselves with the volunteers, and they were able to, when the volunteer when the senior's family was in town and able to take over some of the space, then the volunteers would just naturally pull back, and they worked it out very well. So this was really not an issue at all, and I think that's a little bit of a surprise because it was a concern that it might have been. The volunteers felt that they were well prepared, that the training was helpful. We heard about that. I asked them all, what's the main thing that could be improved about this project? And guess what? But I have to say, I'm going to come back to that. We looked at from the perspective of the volunteers what the impact was on seniors. So this evaluation did not go out and speak to seniors, and you can see why that would be the case. Someone like me, an external person going out to ask, social worky type questions to seniors who there's already a trust consideration, it was just not considered appropriate. So that's another level of evaluation that might happen at another point. But on the whole, we found when we asked about the trust relationship that was developed, seniors were very trusting. So this is one of the questions on the form, is that every time there was a visit, the volunteers were asked to rate on a scale from 1 to 10, no trust at all, to 10, very high trust, how much trust there was in that relationship. And we see from this that overall the big bar is at 10. Most of the time there was a high level of trust, and for sure that developed over time. But you see some of the lower numbers there. There's some 3s, a few 4s and 5s, that there were issues with trust that had to be worked on. But what was so fascinating to hear is, in asking the volunteers about how they decided with the seniors what they were going to do, that they used their wisdom to let the seniors take the lead. And they would just hang back and wait for the seniors to, for example, ask them to go in another room. Otherwise, they would just stay in the same room with the senior. They knew what to do, and they developed a relation, but based on their careful assessment of how comfortable the senior was, and then grew that into a space where then they could be having a fully trusting relationship, and then there would be maybe some confiding of issues, and then some of the issues that seniors were facing might become apparent. So this, I think, was something, the question came up earlier about how this trust developed, and I think that that's something that wasn't, we didn't look to document from the start, but it's something that is really precious in how this actually can work, and I'm glad that we had a chance to talk to some of the volunteers about how that happened. In the ways that isolation was reduced, we've talked about isolated seniors, so what exactly happened to reduce isolation in these cases? In just looking at what happened in the contacts that came through the forms that were filled out, in 55% of the time, 55% of the contacts, there was an opportunity to share and discuss. So a lot of chit chat, a lot of sharing, a lot of family stories, a lot of discussing current events and so on. In about 30% of the contacts, so here I'm talking about the 801 contacts, there was what we would call instrumental support. The volunteer actually helped the senior do a bit of cleaning, took them somewhere to an appointment, helped them hang a picture, did the dishes, whatever. There was some actual physical help being done. And in 15% of the contacts, which were mainly the phone contacts, it was just kind of a regular connection, just a checking in, and that was the main purpose of it. So you see that's fairly in-depth kind of relationship. And so you put that into context that these are relationships that are going on over time, a couple times a week, at least once a week. This level of support is really pretty intense. Also got to ask on the forms if the volunteer felt that there were cases or situations where a need was there that wasn't being met. And in about 25% of these visits, so a quarter of the visits, there are unmet needs. I think this really speaks to there's opportunities to grow the program and fill in some of these needs. Transportation, we heard about this morning, it's a huge need. Just as in all conditions and all seasons, transportation is the number one thing. But also there's some need for help with chores and with cleaning. And although some kinds of services are available in the communities, there's reasons why seniors aren't necessarily comfortable with those services. So, they could be having a better quality of life at being able to enjoy being able to stay at home more if they had more support that was suited towards them. Sometimes help with food. There's food insecurity in this population. Housing is an issue, as we've heard, and also equipment like medical devices, walkers and things like that. There was a need for that because it's not available easily, not necessarily for free. So it was an issue sometimes. So in conclusion, we found that in terms of the capacity to reach and support isolated seniors, what this project has done has enhanced an existing informal network that exists within communities by making the visits more regular and more routine. It's something that is easily manageable for the volunteers. It's something that they are very good at doing, and it increased the volunteers' capacity. So as Walter was giving the example earlier, it gave them information that they might have had partially or knew about and forgotten about what services were out there. So it was top of mind for them when they were interacting with seniors, and that they could say, oh yeah, so there's this and maybe you could try that. It also helped them to be more aware and sensitized to challenges that seniors might be facing, and then be able to discuss that with someone at the office. So to be a little more of a sentinel function, to capture situations before they got more difficult for a senior and provide some prevention. And overall, there's a stronger structure for connecting with and supporting those seniors with an enhanced or a stronger volunteer base in the communities. As well, in terms of the impacts on the seniors and their families, developing trust was indeed a challenge, but I think what these data suggest is that was generally overcome. So we got to the people that were having the trust issues and then worked with them to overcome them. So the seniors developed the connections that helped them reduce social isolation. With the volunteers, in some cases, the volunteers convinced the seniors to go to activities in the community, so then they built networks, and that's like the model that was developed in Montreal, where the seniors were getting together and developing connections among themselves, reducing isolation that way. And the family members, the relationships were positive and complementary. The volunteers were able to provide a support that the family members couldn't always. So the next steps on this, and I was just going to go back for a second to the issue about the forms and speaking about the relationships. There's another issue over and above the burden of the paperwork. Because of the nature of the relationships that the seniors are building with with the volunteers, it's a very personal relationship. It's a kind of friendship very often. And it's kind of inappropriate to be filling out forms about your friends. This is the way we do data collection and evaluation a lot of the time, and this is a case where this really isn't appropriate. And so I really want to thank the members of the evaluation committee, the local project leaders, and all the seniors who kept bringing this to our attention, because I think it's important to note these things. When you're doing an evaluation, an external evaluation, you have every right to say, no, that's not appropriate for our context. And I think we had a kind of a good compromise here, thanks to the dedication of the LPLs who ended up doing a lot of the paperwork and finding these compromises. We have, I think, a pretty good portrait based on the many forms that were filled out, but it was a situation that it was better to have it than not have it, but it was maybe not the easiest way to do it. So I just want to say, again, a big thank you. So the next steps, it's clear that the organizations involved are wanting to continue to maintain these connections. It's a cumulative process because the relationships have been built and they want to, with their volunteers and with the seniors, and they want to keep adding to that as well as maintaining those. So it's kind of like a huge snowball that once it starts rolling just gets bigger and bigger. And I think that has implications also for the structure of funding in the future, because there has to be some consideration to not only bringing on volunteers but maintaining them, as was mentioned in Jody's talk. And there's an interest in building the capacity to reach. There's probably some, I think in the opinions of all of the organizations, some extremely isolated seniors that are extremely reluctant to have anyone visit them, to continue to build that capacity and build on the learnings from this project to get a little farther each time. That's it.
How important was that theory of change that you used?
It's probably most important to me because it structures where the evaluation focus is going to be. And then now the conclusions point back to the theory of change. So I can say, yes, this part of the theory worked out. We showed that this link that we expected or hypothesized would be there is actually working. This area is maybe a little less strong, and these are maybe some reasons why. So we can tie it back to that and say, if we were going forward to design a new program or to take this program to a next step, here's where we would reinforce in our theory of change, and this is what we would expect to see and why. So it provides a structure for the kind of the story that you want to be able to tell about how it worked and how it might work in the future.
So thank you again, Natalie.